The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger with each passing minute, and Sarah wiped her hands nervously on her worn apron as she watched from behind the cracked window of the dusty Rose Saloon. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the small frontier town of Copper Creek, casting long shadows across the empty main street. Most folks had taken shelter indoors, waiting for the heat to break, but Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away from that approaching figure. She had been working at the saloon for 3 years now, serving drinks and enduring the rough hands and cruder comments of miners, drifters, and cattle hands who passed through town. It wasn't the life she had dreamed of as a young girl back in Philadelphia, but circumstances had a way of reshaping dreams into survival. Her father's gambling debts had followed her family west, and when he died of fever 2 winters ago, those debts had become her burden to bear. The rider was getting closer now, and something about the way he sat in his saddle, the careful way he scanned the buildings as he approached, made her stomach clench with an odd mixture of anticipation and dread. There was something familiar about that silhouette, something that pulled at memories she had tried so hard to bury. Behind her, the saloon was beginning to stir with its usual late afternoon crowd. Old Pete the bartender was polishing glasses with practiced efficiency, while 3 ranch hands argued over a card game at the corner table. The piano player, a thin man named Charlie who claimed to have once performed in San Francisco, was running through scales in preparation for the evening's entertainment. None of them paid any attention to Sarah's vigil at the window. The stranger dismounted in front of the general store across the street, his movements fluid and confident. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes that had seen hard travel, and when he turned to tie his horse to the hitching post, Sarah caught her first clear glimpse of his face. The blood drained from her cheeks, and she gripped the window frame so tightly her knuckles turned white. It was Thomas Brennan. After 5 years, he had come back. Sarah's mind raced backward to that terrible night when everything had changed. She had been 17 then, the daughter of the town's most respected merchant, engaged to marry the banker's son in what everyone called the social event of the season. Thomas had been the son of a local rancher, handsome and wild, with dreams of making his fortune in the gold fields of California. They had met in secret for months, stealing kisses behind the church, and making promises they both believed they could keep. But her father had discovered their relationship just days before her wedding to Jonathan Whitmore. The confrontation had been brutal, with accusations and threats flying like bullets in a gunfight. Thomas had been given a choice: leave town immediately and never return, or face charges for theft that her father claimed he could easily prove. The missing money from her father's safe would be attributed to the young man's desperation to elope with his daughter. Sarah had begged Thomas to stay and fight to prove his innocence, but he had looked at her with those dark eyes she loved so much and shaken his head. He wouldn't drag her down with him, he said. She deserved better than a life on the run with a man marked as a criminal. He had kissed her one last time, promised he would return when he could clear his name, and ridden out of town before dawn. She had waited for him for 2 years, refusing to marry Jonathan despite her father's increasing pressure. But then the fever had taken her parents, the debts had surfaced, and she had learned the truth about her father's business dealings. The missing money Thomas had been accused of stealing had never existed. Her father had been desperate to cover his own gambling losses and had seen an opportunity to remove an unsuitable suitor while protecting his reputation. By the time Sarah understood the full scope of her father's deception, Thomas was long gone, disappeared into the vastness of the frontier. She had tried to find him, hiring investigators with money she couldn't afford, but it was as if he had vanished from the earth. Eventually, her resources exhausted and her situation increasingly desperate, she had been forced to take work wherever she could find it. The Dusty Rose Saloon wasn't respectable, but it provided enough income to keep her creditors at bay and put food on her table. Now he was here, walking across the street toward the saloon with the same confident stride she remembered from their youth. But this wasn't the idealistic young man who had ridden out of town 5 years ago. This Thomas moved like a predator, his hand resting casually on the grip of his pistol, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. The frontier had changed him, hardened him into something dangerous and unpredictable. Sarah backed away from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. What was she going to do? Would he recognize her? Did she want him to? The woman standing in this saloon, wearing a low-cut dress and serving whiskey to rough men, bore little resemblance to the innocent merchant's daughter he had once known. Life had marked her just as surely as it had marked him, though perhaps in less obvious ways. The saloon door swung open, and Thomas stepped inside, pausing to let his eyes adjust to the dimmer light. Sarah quickly turned her back to him and busied herself wiping down tables, hoping her trembling hands weren't too obvious. She could feel his presence like a physical weight, the familiar scent of leather and sage that seemed to follow him wherever he went. "What can I get you, stranger?" Pete called out from behind the bar, already reaching for a bottle of whiskey. It was his standard greeting for anyone he didn't recognize, delivered with the practiced neutrality of a man who had learned not to ask too many questions in a place like Copper Creek. "Just a drink and some information," Thomas replied, his voice deeper than Sarah remembered, roughened by years of hard living. "I'm looking for someone who might have passed through here. A woman." Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. Was he looking for her? After all these years, had he finally come back to find her? But then logic reasserted itself. He had no way of knowing she was here, no reason to believe she had ended up in this particular town among the dozens scattered across the territory. "Lots of women pass through Copper Creek," Pete said with a chuckle, pouring a generous measure of amber liquid into a glass. "You're going to have to be more specific than that, friend." Thomas accepted the drink and took a small sip, his eyes continuing their methodical survey of the room. When his gaze passed over Sarah, she held her breath, but he showed no sign of recognition. Of course not, she told herself. Why would he look for the woman he had once loved among the working girls of Frontier Saloon? Her name was Sarah Mitchell, Thomas said quietly, and Sarah nearly dropped the glass she was holding. She would be about 22 now, blonde hair, green eyes. Last I heard, she was living in Philadelphia, but that was several years ago. Sarah's maiden name. He was still looking for the girl she used to be, not the woman she had become. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she had to grip the back of a chair to keep from swaying on her feet. "Mitchell, you say?" Pete scratched his grizzled chin thoughtfully. "Can't say that name rings a bell. Course, lots of folks out here ain't using the names they was born with, if you catch my meaning. This someone special to you?" There was a long pause before Thomas answered, and when he did, his voice carried a weight of regret that made Sarah's heart ache. "She was going to be my wife once. Before I made some bad choices and had to leave town, I always promised myself I'd come back for her when I could offer her the life she deserved. And can you now?" Pete asked, refilling the glass without being asked. "Offer her that life? I mean..." Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch, setting it on the bar with a soft clink of metal. "I've done well for myself in California. Gold mining, then freight hauling, and finally some very profitable investments in railroad stock. I've got a ranch now, good land with water rights, and enough money to last several lifetimes. All I need is someone to share it with." Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes. He had succeeded, just as he had always dreamed he would. He had made his fortune and come back to claim the woman he loved, never knowing that she had lost everything and fallen so far from the pedestal he had placed her on. How could she tell him that the pure, innocent girl he remembered was gone, replaced by a woman who served drinks to rough men and had learned to defend herself with both sharp words and a hidden knife? "Well, I hope you find her," Pete said sincerely. Man ought to have a chance to make things right with the woman he loves, especially if he's got the means to do it proper. Thomas nodded and drained his glass, leaving money on the bar. "I'll be staying at the hotel for a few days, making inquiries. If you hear anything, or if anyone remembers seeing someone matching her description, I'd be grateful for the information." He turned to leave, and Sarah knew this was her moment. She could call out to him, reveal herself, and see if the love they had shared could survive the changes that life had wrought in both of them. Or she could let him walk away, let him keep searching for a woman who no longer existed, and spare them both the pain of confronting what they had become. As Thomas reached the doors, he paused and turned back toward the room. His eyes swept across the saloon one more time, and for just an instant, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of something in his expression. Recognition? Suspicion? But then he shook his head slightly and pushed through the doors, disappearing back into the bright afternoon sunlight. Sarah sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly too weak to support her. The other patrons had returned to their conversations and card games, unaware of the drama that had just played out in their midst. Only Pete seemed to notice her distress, shooting her a questioning look from behind the bar. "You all right?" Sarah?" he asked quietly when the noise level rose enough to cover their conversation. "You look like you just seen a ghost." In a way, she had. The ghost of her former self. The ghost of the life she might have lived. The ghost of the love she had thought was lost forever. But ghosts were dangerous things, and sometimes it was better to let them rest in peace rather than risk disturbing the fragile stability of the present. "I'm fine," she lied, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "Just tired, I suppose. The heat's been getting to me all day." Pete nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Why don't you take a few minutes in the back room? Cool off a bit before the evening crowd starts rolling in." Sarah accepted his offer gratefully, retreating to the small storage room behind the bar where she could finally allow her composure to crumble. She pressed her back against the rough wooden wall and let the tears come, mourning not just for what she had lost, but for what she could never have again. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the town going about its daily business, unaware that her entire world had just been turned upside down by the appearance of a man she had thought she would never see again. The question now was what she was going to do about it. Thomas would be staying in town for several days, continuing his search for a woman who was sitting less than 100 yards away from his hotel room. The irony was almost too cruel to bear. But perhaps cruelty was exactly what the situation called for. Perhaps it would be kinder to both of them if she remained hidden, if she let him exhaust his search and move on to the next town, the next lead, the next false hope. He deserved to find love and happiness, but did he deserve to find them with a woman who could never again be the innocent girl he remembered? As the afternoon wore on and the saloon began to fill with its regular evening crowd, Sarah forced herself to return to work, serving drinks and deflecting unwanted advances with the skill born of long practice. But her mind remained fixed on the man sleeping in the hotel across the street, and the impossible choice that fate had placed before her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to either reveal herself or remain hidden. For now, all she could do was try to make it through the night without falling apart completely, and hope that whatever decision she ultimately made would be the right one for both of them. The morning sun was barely peeking over the eastern mountains when Sarah heard the familiar creak of boot leather on the wooden sidewalk outside the saloon. She had been awake for hours, unable to sleep after the previous day's shocking encounter, and had come downstairs early to help Pete prepare for the breakfast crowd. Through the window, she watched Thomas emerge from the hotel, looking every inch the successful businessman in his clean shirt and pressed trousers, despite the gun belt that marked him as a man who had learned to defend himself. He moved with purpose, heading straight for the sheriff's office at the end of the street. Sarah's heart sank as she realized he was being methodical about his search, starting with the law and working his way through every person in town who might have information about a woman named Sarah Mitchell. It was only a matter of time before someone mentioned the saloon girl with the same first name, even if her last name was now Carson, the false identity she had adopted when she fled Philadelphia. "He's up early," Pete observed, following her gaze. "Determined sort, ain't he?" Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She had wrestled with her decision all night, and morning had brought no clarity, only a deeper sense of dread at the impossible situation she found herself in. Every instinct told her to run, to pack her few possessions, and catch the next stage out of town before Thomas could discover the truth. But another part of her, the part that had never stopped loving him despite everything that had happened, wanted desperately to reveal herself and damn the consequences. The morning passed slowly, with Sarah jumping at every sound that might herald Thomas's return. She served coffee and eggs to the early risers, mostly miners heading out to their claims and ranchers beginning their daily rounds. But her attention remained fixed on the activity across the street. She watched Thomas emerge from the sheriff's office, then visit the general store, the bank, and the telegraph office. Each stop brought him closer to the inevitable moment when someone would mention her. Around noon, her worst fears were realized when Molly Henderson, the town's most notorious gossip, came bustling into the saloon with news practically bursting from her lips. Molly cleaned rooms at the hotel and had clearly been eavesdropping on Thomas's conversations with other guests. "Pete, you'll never guess what that handsome stranger is up to," Molly announced breathlessly, settling herself at the bar with the self-important air of someone bearing exciting information. "He's looking for a lost love, a woman named Sarah. Says he's been searching for her for years." Sarah's blood turned to ice, but She forced herself to continue wiping down tables, as if the conversation held no interest for her. Pete shot her a quick glance, and she could see the wheels turning in his mind. He had always been sharp, and the coincidence of names would not escape him for long. "Is that so?" Pete replied carefully, pouring Molly her usual midday sherry. "A lot of Sarahs in the world. What makes him think she might be here in Copper Creek?" "Oh, he doesn't specifically think she's here," Molly clarified, taking a delicate sip of her drink. "He's been following a trail of sorts, town to town, asking questions. Apparently, she disappeared from back east somewhere, and he's determined to find her. Says he's got a fortune now, and wants to make her his wife." The glass Sarah was holding slipped from her numb fingers and shattered on the floor. Both Pete and Molly turned to look at her, and Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks as she knelt to clean up the broken pieces. "Careful there, honey," Molly called out. "You've been awful jumpy lately." "Everything all right. Just clumsy today, I suppose," Sarah managed, grateful that her voice came out steadier than she felt. But when she looked up, she found Pete's knowing eyes fixed on her with an expression that said he was putting the pieces together far too quickly for her comfort. The afternoon brought a new torture when Thomas returned to the saloon, this time with Sheriff Harrison in tow. Sarah's heart hammered as she recognized the lawman's heavy tread on the wooden steps. She quickly retreated to the back room, leaving Pete to handle whatever questions they might have. From her hiding place, she could hear their voices clearly through the thin walls. Thomas was being thorough, describing Sarah's appearance in detail, providing Sheriff Harrison with information about her family background, and the circumstances of her disappearance from Philadelphia. Some of the details were surprisingly accurate, suggesting that Thomas had done considerable research before beginning his search. "Can't say I know anyone matching that description," Sheriff Harrison said thoughtfully. "Of course, lots of folks come and go through Copper Creek. Not everyone registers their real names at the hotel, if you catch my meaning. People come west to start over, sometimes with good reason to leave their past behind." "I understand that," Thomas replied, his frustration evident in his voice. "But Sarah isn't running from the law or trying to hide from anything shameful. When I left Philadelphia, she was engaged to be married to a respectable man. If she disappeared, it was because something terrible happened to her or her family." Sarah closed her eyes against the pain of his words. He still believed in her innocence, still thought of her as the virtuous young woman she had been 5 years ago. How could she tell him that his faith had been misplaced, that the terrible thing that had happened was simply the slow erosion of respectability that came with poverty and desperation? "What about your girls?" Sheriff Harrison asked, and Sarah could hear the creak of his chair as he shifted to face Pete. "Either of them matched this description? What are their names again?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Pete knew her real first name, though he had never pried into her background beyond what was necessary for employment. Now she waited to see if he would betray her secret or protect her privacy. "I've got 2 girls working here," Pete said slowly, and Sarah could picture him polishing a glass as he spoke, a nervous habit when he was thinking carefully. "One's a redhead named Betty, been here about 6 months. The other's blonde, name of Sarah, but she's been in Copper Creek for 3 years now. Goes by Carson, though I never asked if that was her married name or maiden name." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah pressed her hand over her mouth to stifle any sound as she heard Thomas's sharp intake of breath. "Sarah Carson," Thomas repeated, testing the name. "Could I speak with her?" "She's not here right now," Pete lied smoothly, and Sarah felt a rush of gratitude toward the gruff bartender who had become more of a father figure than an employer over the years. "Went to visit her sick aunt over in Pine Ridge. Won't be back for a couple days." Another lie, but one that might buy her some time to figure out what to do. Sarah sagged against the wall, relief and terror warring in her chest. Pete was protecting her, but he couldn't shield her forever. When she failed to return from her fictional trip, Thomas would become suspicious, and his search would intensify. "Pine Ridge," Thomas mused. "How far is that from here?" "About a day's ride southwest," Sheriff Harrison supplied. "Small mining camp, mostly. Not much there besides a few prospectors and their families." "I see." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then Sarah heard the scrape of his chair as he stood. "Thank you for your time, gentlemen. If this Sarah Carson returns before I finish my business in other towns, I'd appreciate the chance to speak with her. Even if she's not the woman I'm looking for, she might have information about others who've passed through the area." After the 2 men left, Sarah remained hidden in the back room for several more minutes, trying to collect herself. When she finally emerged, she found Pete waiting for her with a concerned expression and a shot glass filled with whiskey. "Drink this," he said gently, pressing the glass into her shaking hands. "Then you're going to tell me what's really going on here." Sarah downed the whiskey in one gulp, feeling the familiar burn as it hit her empty stomach. Then, for the first time since arriving in Copper Creek, she told someone the truth about her past. She spoke about her father's debts and deception, about Thomas's forced exile, and her own fall from grace. Pete listened without interruption, his weathered face showing no judgment, only sympathy for a young woman who had faced impossible choices and done her best to survive them. "So this Thomas fella is the one that got away," Pete summarized when she finished. "And you're afraid he won't want the woman you've become." "How can I tell him what I've been reduced to?" Sarah asked desperately. "He still thinks I'm the respectable young woman he left behind. He doesn't know that I've been serving drinks to drunks and fighting off grabby customers for 3 years. He doesn't know that I've had to do things, make compromises, just to survive." "Has he?" Pete asked quietly. "Has he what?" "Had to do things to survive. Make compromises. You said he's been gone 5 years, made a fortune somehow. You think a man gets rich quick on the frontier by keeping his hands clean and his conscience spotless?" Sarah stared at him, the implications of his words sinking in slowly. She had been so focused on her own transformation, her own fall from innocence, that she hadn't considered what Thomas might have had to do to achieve the success he now enjoyed. The boy who had left Philadelphia with nothing but the clothes on his back had become a man wealthy enough to finance an extended search across multiple territories. That kind of transformation didn't happen without cost. "The question ain't whether you've both changed," Pete continued. "The question is whether you've changed so much that what you had together is gone forever, or if maybe you've both learned enough about the world to appreciate something real when you find it again." Before Sarah could respond, the saloon doors swung open and Betty rushed in, her face flushed with excitement and exertion. She had been visiting friends across town and had clearly run back with news. "Sarah, you missed all the excitement," Betty gasped, pressing a hand to her side as she caught her breath. "That handsome stranger from yesterday? Turns out he's more than just a rich man looking for his lost love. Jenny's cousin works over at the livery stable, and she says his horse is carrying some serious gear. Not just traveling gear, but the kind of equipment a bounty hunter might use." Sarah's blood turned cold. "What do you mean?" "Well, Jenny's cousin knows about these things on account of his brother being a deputy over in Silver Falls. He says this Thomas fellow has got tracking equipment, weapons that aren't just for protection, and what looked like wanted posters in his saddlebags. Word is, he's not just looking for some lost love. He's hunting someone." The room seemed to spin around Sarah as the implications hit her. Thomas wasn't just a successful businessman who had come back to claim his bride. He was a bounty hunter, a man who tracked down wanted criminals for money. Was his search for a part of some job? Had someone put a price on her head for her father's crimes, or for debts she couldn't pay? But that didn't make sense either. If Thomas was hunting her for money, why the elaborate story about lost love and promises to make her his wife? Unless he had discovered something about her father's business dealings that she didn't know about. Something that made her valuable to someone else. Did Jenny's cousin say anything else? Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice level despite the panic rising in her chest. Just that he seemed to know what he was doing with the equipment. Like a man who's had plenty of practice tracking people who don't want to be found. Betty paused, studying Sarah's pale face with growing concern. "Why? Is everything all right?" Pete stepped in before Sarah could answer, his protective instincts clearly aroused. "Betty, why don't you go freshen up? Evening crowd will be starting soon, and I want you looking your best." After Betty disappeared upstairs, Pete turned back to Sarah with a grave expression. "This changes things, doesn't it?" Sarah nodded, her mind racing through possibilities and scenarios, none of them comforting. If Thomas was indeed a bounty hunter, then his appearance in Copper Creek might not be the coincidence she had assumed. Someone might have hired him to find her, someone with a claim on her father's estate or a grudge against her family. The romantic reunion she had both longed for and dreaded might be nothing more than an elaborate trap. But there was another possibility, one that made her heart ache with a different kind of pain. What if Thomas had become a bounty hunter specifically to develop the skills needed to find her? What if years of searching through conventional means had driven him to learn tracking and hunting techniques that would make his quest more effective? In that case, his profession might be a tool rather than a betrayal, a means to an end rather than evidence of fundamental change in his character. I need to know, Sarah said finally, her voice stronger than it had been all day. I need to know whether he's here for love or money, whether he's the man I remember or someone else entirely. That sounds dangerous, Pete warned. If he's a bounty hunter, and if someone has put a price on your head, getting close to him could be walking into a trap. And if he's not? If he's exactly who he says he is, and I let him leave without ever revealing myself. Sarah shook her head. I've been running from my past for 3 years, Pete. Maybe it's time to face it, one way or another. As evening approached, and the saloon filled with its usual mix of miners, drifters, and local ranchers, Sarah made her decision. She would find a way to observe Thomas without revealing herself, to discover the truth about his motives before deciding whether to trust him with the secret of her identity. It was risky, but the alternative was to spend the rest of her life wondering what might have been. The first part of her plan was simple enough. When Thomas returned to the saloon that evening, as she was certain he would, she would be ready with questions of her own. But this time, instead of hiding in the back room, she would face him directly and see if she could read the truth in those dark eyes that had once promised her the world. The evening crowd at the Dusty Rose was thicker than usual, with word having spread about the mysterious stranger who was asking questions around town. Sarah had changed into her best dress, a deep blue silk that had once belonged to a merchant's wife who had left it as payment for her husband's drinking debts. It was still respectable despite its age, and Sarah hoped it would help her blend in with a more legitimate female clientele who occasionally visited the saloon with their menfolk. She positioned herself at a corner table where she could observe the room while remaining partially hidden in the shadows. Betty was working the floor with her usual efficiency, her red hair catching the lamplight as she navigated between tables full of men eager for conversation and companionship. Pete stood behind the bar like a fortress wall, his experienced eyes cataloging every face and potential source of trouble. Thomas arrived just after sunset, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she got her first good look at him in proper lighting. The years had been kind to him in some ways, filling out his frame and adding an air of authority that made him stand out even in a room full of hardened frontiermen. But there were new lines around his eyes and a wariness in his expression that spoke of difficult experiences and hard-won wisdom. He chose a table near the center of the room where he could watch both the front entrance and the stairs leading to the second floor. Sarah recognized the positioning immediately as that of a man who had learned to be constantly aware of his surroundings, never allowing potential threats to approach from his blind spots. It was professional behavior, the kind of instinctive caution that came from years of dangerous work. As the evening progressed, Sarah watched Thomas interact with the other patrons. He was polite, but reserved, answering questions about his business in town, without revealing more than necessary. When Betty approached his table to refill his whiskey, he engaged her in conversation with the easy charm Sarah remembered, but his eyes remained alert, scanning the room even as he smiled at the girl's flirtations. "Evening, stranger," called out Jake Morrison, one of the local ranch hands who had been drinking steadily since late afternoon. "Heard you're looking for a woman. Maybe you ain't looking hard enough in the right places." His gesture toward Betty was crude and obvious, drawing laughs from his companions. Thomas's expression didn't change, but Sarah noticed his hand shift slightly closer to his gun. "I'm looking for someone specific," he replied evenly. "But I appreciate the suggestion." "Specific, huh?" Jake's voice grew louder, encouraged by the attention from the crowd. "What makes this one so special that you're willing to chase her all over creation? She must be something pretty extraordinary." For a moment, Thomas's professional composure slipped, and Sarah saw a flash of the young man she had once known. His voice, when he spoke, carried a depth of emotion that made her heart clench with remembered pain. "She is extraordinary," he said quietly. "She's kind and intelligent, with a strength that doesn't need to prove itself through cruelty or violence. She sees the best in people, even when they can't see it in themselves. And I was a fool to let circumstances drive me away from her." The honesty in his words cut through the saloon's rough atmosphere like a blade, silencing even Jake Morrison's drunken commentary. Sarah felt tears stinging her eyes as she realized that whatever else Thomas might have become, whatever profession he might have adopted, his love for her remained unchanged. The question was whether that love was based on reality or on an idealized memory of a woman who no longer existed. As if sensing her intense scrutiny, Thomas suddenly turned and looked directly at her corner table. Their eyes met across the smoky room, and Sarah felt the world stop spinning for a moment. Recognition flickered in his expression, followed by confusion and something that might have been hope. He started to rise from his chair, his gaze never leaving her face. Panic seized Sarah, and she quickly stood and hurried toward the back stairs, hoping to escape to her room before he could reach her. But the saloon was crowded, and her progress was slowed by tables and patrons. She could hear Thomas calling out behind her, his voice rising above the general noise. "Wait! Sarah, please wait!" The use of her real name caused several heads to turn, including Pete's behind the bar. Sarah pushed through the crowd more desperately, but just as she reached the bottom of the stairs, a strong hand caught her arm gently but firmly. "Sarah Mitchell," Thomas said, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "It really is you." She turned to face him, knowing there was no escape now. Up close, the changes in his face were even more evident. There were small scars on his hands and neck, evidence of violence in his recent past. But his eyes, those deep brown eyes that had haunted her dreams for 5 years, remained exactly as she remembered them. "It's Sarah Carson now," she said quietly, pulling her arm free from his grasp. "Sarah Mitchell died in Philadelphia 5 years ago." Thomas studied her face intently, and she could see him cataloging the changes that time and hardship had wrought. Her cheekbones were more prominent now. Her eyes held shadows that hadn't been there in their youth, and there was a wariness in her posture that spoke of learned caution. "You've been here all along," he said, his voice mixing accusation with hurt. "For 3 years," Pete said. "You've been here while I've been searching half the continent for you." "You shouldn't have been searching at all," Sarah replied, conscious that their conversation was drawing attention from curious patrons. "We both moved on with our lives. That's what you told me to do when you left." "I told you to wait for me," Thomas countered. "I promised I would come back when I could offer you the life you deserved." Sarah looked around at the saloon, at the rough men and working girls who made up her daily world, and gave a bitter laugh. "This is the life I deserved, apparently. This is what became of your precious, innocent Sarah Mitchell." Before Thomas could respond, Pete's voice cut through the tension. "Maybe you two should take this conversation somewhere more private," he suggested diplomatically. "My back room's available if you need a quiet place to talk." Sarah wanted to refuse, to maintain the distance that had protected her from exactly this kind of pain. But she could see the confusion and hurt in Thomas's eyes, and she realized that he deserved an explanation, even if the truth would destroy whatever romantic notions he had harbored about their reunion. "Fine," she said reluctantly, "but this conversation ends tonight, Thomas. After tonight, you continue your search in other towns, and I continue my life here." "Understood," he nodded, though his expression suggested he had no intention of honoring that agreement. Pete led them through the crowd to the small storage room behind the bar, clearing away boxes to make space for 2 chairs. He lit an oil lamp and set on a makeshift table, then retreated to the main room, closing the door behind him to give them privacy. For several moments, they sat in silence, each studying the other in the lamp's flickering light. Sarah could see Thomas struggling to reconcile the woman before him with his memories of the girl he had left behind. Finally, he spoke. "Tell me what happened," he said simply. "Tell me how you ended up here." Sarah took a shaky breath and began the story she had never told in its entirety to anyone, not even Pete. She spoke about her father's death and the discovery of his debts, about her failed engagement to Jonathan Whitmore, and the gradual erosion of her social standing. She described the investigator she had hired to find Thomas, the money she had spent chasing false leads, and empty promises. She explained her journey west, the series of increasingly desperate jobs she had taken to survive, and, finally, her arrival in Copper Creek 3 years ago. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time, his hands clenched into fists on the table between them. "Your father lied about the missing money," he said finally. "There was never any theft. He made that up to get rid of me." "I know," Sarah replied. "I figured that out after he died, when I found his real account books. But by then, you were long gone, and I had no way to find you." "I should have stayed and fought," Thomas said bitterly. "I should have called his bluff and demanded proof of his accusations. Instead, I ran like a coward and left you to face the consequences alone. You were protecting me, Sarah reminded him. Or at least you thought you were. We were both young and naive. We thought there would be time to fix things later. Thomas reached across the table and took her hands in his, and Sarah was shocked by how familiar and comforting the touch felt despite everything that had changed between them. I've spent 5 years making myself worthy of you, he said earnestly. I have money now and everything I thought you would need for the life you deserved. I can give you back everything you lost. Sarah pulled her hands away, the gesture more painful than any words could have been. You can't give me back what I've lost, Thomas. You can't make me innocent again or erase the things I've had to do to survive. The girl you're looking for doesn't exist anymore. Then I'll love the woman you've become, he said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, cutting through all her defenses and touching a part of her that had never stopped hoping for exactly this moment. But hope was a luxury she had learned to live without, and she couldn't afford to let it cloud her judgment now. You don't know what I've become, she said desperately. You don't know the compromises I've made, the things I've done just to put food on my table. I'm not the pure, respectable woman you want to marry. I'm a saloon girl, Thomas. I serve drinks to rough men and let them think they have a chance with me because it's good for business. I've learned to use a knife to defend myself, and I've had to use it more than once. I'm not suitable to be anyone's wife, especially not the wife of a successful businessman. Thomas was quiet for a moment, then surprised her by laughing softly. You think I care about any of that? You think 5 years on the frontier haven't taught me anything about what's really important in this world? I think you've romanticized a memory, Sarah replied. I think you spent so much time searching for someone who doesn't exist that you've forgotten what reality looks like. Let me tell you about my reality, Thomas said, his voice taking on a hard edge that made Sarah suddenly aware of just how dangerous he had become. I spent 2 years in the California goldfields, working claims and fighting off claim jumpers. I've killed 4 men in self-defense and wounded several others. I built my freight business by being willing to take routes that other men were too smart or too scared to attempt. And yes, I've worked as a bounty hunter when the money was right and the cause was just. Sarah's breath caught at the confirmation of what Betty had reported. So it's true. You hunt people for money. I hunt criminals for money, Thomas corrected. Men who've committed real crimes, not trumped-up charges like your father tried to pin on me. And I've gotten very good at it, good enough to build the fortune I promised you I would earn. He leaned forward, his dark eyes intense in the lamplight. The point is, Sarah, that I'm not the innocent boy you remember either. The frontier changes everyone who survives it. But it hasn't changed the way I feel about you, and it hasn't changed my belief that some things are worth fighting for. Sarah stared at him, trying to process this revelation. The successful businessman she had imagined was real enough, but he was built on a foundation of violence and danger that made her own compromises seem almost respectable by comparison. It was a strange kind of comfort to realize that they had both been forced to adapt to survive, both learned to do things they never would have imagined in their youth. There's something else you should know, she said quietly. There haven't been any men. Not in the way you might be thinking. I've never let any of the customers get that close, never sold more than drinks and conversation. But people assume things about saloon girls, and I've never tried very hard to correct those assumptions because sometimes it's safer to let men think you're experienced than to let them know you're vulnerable. Thomas's expression softened, and Sarah could see relief in his eyes that he tried to hide. It wouldn't matter to me if there had been, he said gently. You did what you had to do to survive, just like I did. The past is past, Sarah. The question is what we do with the future. Before Sarah could respond, there was a soft knock on the door, and Pete's voice came through the thin wood. Sorry to interrupt, but we've got a situation out here that might concern you folks. Thomas immediately stood, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Years of dangerous work had made him react to potential threats without conscious thought. Sarah followed him to the door, her heart racing with a different kind of fear. Pete was waiting for them with an expression of barely controlled anger. Sheriff Harrison just left, he said quietly. Seems someone sent a telegram to the territorial marshal's office about a wanted woman hiding in my establishment. Description matches you pretty closely, Sarah. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Wanted for what? Embezzlement and fraud, according to the telegram. Seems someone in Philadelphia is claiming you helped your father steal money from several prominent families before he died. They're saying you took the money and ran west to avoid prosecution. Thomas stepped protectively closer to Sarah, his professional instincts clearly aroused. Who sent the telegram? Did Harrison say? Jonathan Whitmore, Pete replied grimly. Your former fiancé, according to what you told me. Apparently, he's been looking for you too, but not for the same reasons as Thomas here. The room seemed to spin around Sarah as the implications sank in. Jonathan had found her, and he was using the law to force her back to Philadelphia to face charges for crimes she had never committed. But why now after all these years? What had motivated him to suddenly renew his search? The answer came to her with sickening clarity. Thomas's inquiries had been thorough, reaching back to Philadelphia and involving people who might remember Sarah Mitchell. Jonathan must have learned that someone was looking for her, someone with enough money to finance an extended search. If Thomas had found her and claimed her as his wife, any legal action against her would become much more complicated. He wants to discredit me before you can marry me, Sarah said numbly. He's been waiting for someone like you to show up, someone who might actually be able to help me fight back. This is his way of making sure that doesn't happen. Thomas's expression had gone cold and dangerous, and Sarah suddenly understood why men might fear facing him in a fight. How long before the marshal arrives? He asked Pete. Harrison said maybe 3 days depending on weather and how seriously they take the charges. Could be sooner if they're really motivated. 3 days to decide whether to run again or stand and fight. 3 days to determine whether the love they had rediscovered was strong enough to survive the challenges that lay ahead. Sarah looked at Thomas, seeing her own determination reflected in his dark eyes, and realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't facing her troubles alone. The night passed in a blur of whispered conversations and desperate planning. Thomas had moved his belongings from the hotel to the saloon's upstairs rooms, claiming he wanted to be closer to his investigation while actually positioning himself to protect Sarah from any immediate threats. Pete had closed the saloon early, citing a problem with the beer barrels, and the three of them huddled around a table in the main room, mapping out their limited options. We could run, Thomas said, his finger tracing routes on a crude map he had sketched from memory. I know trails through the mountains that most lawmen wouldn't think to follow. We could be in California within a week, maybe Mexico in 2. Sarah shook her head firmly. Running will only confirm my guilt in everyone's eyes. And what kind of life would that be, always looking over our shoulders, never able to settle anywhere for long? I'm tired of running, Thomas. I've been doing it for 3 years already. Then, we fight, Thomas replied simply. I've got contacts, people who owe me favors. We could bring in lawyers, investigators, witnesses who might remember the truth about your father's business dealings. With what money? Sarah asked bitterly. Jonathan Whitmore has the resources of his father's bank behind him, plus whatever political connections he's made over the years. I'm a saloon girl with no reputation and no proof of my innocence. Who's going to believe my word against his? Pete cleared his throat from behind the bar, where he had been listening while cleaning glasses. Maybe the question ain't about proving your innocence, he said thoughtfully. Maybe the question is proving his guilt. Both Thomas and Sarah turned to look at the older man, who set down his cleaning rag and joined them at the table. His weathered face was creased with concentration, and Sarah recognized the expression he wore when he was working through a particularly complex problem. Think about it, Pete continued. This Jonathan fellow waited 5 years to accuse you of these crimes. Why now? What changed? And why use embezzlement charges instead of just having you arrested for unpaid debts, which would be a lot easier to prove? Thomas leaned forward, his bounty hunter instincts clearly engaged. He's right. The timing is suspicious. And embezzlement requires intent to defraud, which is much harder to prove than simple debt. Unless he needs me discredited for reasons that have nothing to do with money, Sarah finished, the pieces suddenly clicking together in her mind. Pete, what did you say about the telegram? Did Sheriff Harrison mention any specific details about the charges? Pete nodded, pulling a folded paper from his pocket. Harrison left a copy. Says here you're accused of forging documents and stealing funds from the Whitmore Family Trust, among others. Claims you and your father worked together to embezzle nearly $50,000 before he died. Sarah gasped at the enormity of the sum. $50,000? That's impossible. My father never had access to that kind of money. and if he had, we wouldn't have been facing debts when he died. But Jonathan would have access to those kinds of funds, Thomas said grimly. As the bank president's son, he would have been handling trust accounts and estate settlements. Sarah, what if your father wasn't a thief? What if Jonathan has been stealing from his own bank for years, and he used your father's death as cover to hide his crimes? The possibility hit Sarah like a physical blow. It would explain so much. Jonathan's eagerness to marry her despite her father's supposed debts, his willingness to wait years before pursuing charges, his sudden urgency now that someone with resources had come looking for her. If he had been embezzling from the bank's trust accounts, he would need someone to blame when the theft was eventually discovered. That's a serious accusation, Pete warned. You got any proof to back it up? Thomas stood and began pacing, his mind clearly working through possibilities. Not yet, but I know people who could get proof if it exists. The problem is time. We've got maybe 3 days before the marshal arrives, and it would take weeks to properly investigate Jonathan's financial dealings. Then we don't investigate, Sarah said quietly. We make him come to us. Both men stared at her, and Sarah felt a surge of the old determination that had carried her through the darkest periods of the past 5 years. She was tired of being a victim, tired of reacting to other people's moves instead of making her own. Think about it, she continued, her voice growing stronger. Jonathan sent that telegram because he's afraid. He's afraid that I might have evidence of his crimes, or that Thomas might have the resources to investigate and expose him. What if we let him think his fears are justified? Thomas's eyes lit up with understanding. You want to bait him into making a mistake. I want to force his hand, Sarah corrected. If he's been stealing money and using my family as a cover, then he's been living in fear of discovery for 5 years. That kind of stress makes people desperate, and desperate people make poor decisions. Pete looked skeptical. That's assuming he takes the bait. What if he just lets the marshal arrest you and considers the problem solved? Sarah smiled for the first time since the crisis had begun, and Thomas recognized the expression from their youth. It was the look she got when she was about to do something that would shock the adults around them. He can't let the marshal arrest me, she said confidently. Because if I'm arrested and brought back to Philadelphia for trial, I'll be able to testify about my father's real financial situation. I'll be able to tell a judge and jury that my father never had access to the kind of money Jonathan claims we stole. And if Thomas is willing to hire investigators and lawyers to support my case, those investigators might start looking very closely at who did have access to those trust accounts. Thomas grinned, his appreciation for her strategy evident in his expression. So we make sure Jonathan knows that I'm here, that I'm wealthy enough to finance a real defense, and that I'm planning to marry you. We let him understand that arresting you will only make his problems worse. And then we wait for him to do something stupid, Pete added, catching on to the plan. Like trying to stop the wedding, or paying someone to make sure you don't make it back to Philadelphia alive. The implications of that possibility sobered all three of them. If Jonathan was indeed guilty of embezzlement, and if he saw Sarah as a threat to his freedom and reputation, he might be desperate enough to resort to violence. It wouldn't be the first time a wealthy man had hired criminals to solve his problems permanently. That's why this plan might work, Thomas said grimly. But it's also why it's dangerous. If Jonathan is as guilty as we think he is, he'll be fighting for his life and freedom. Men in that position are capable of almost anything. Sarah reached across the table and took Thomas's hand, drawing strength from the contact. I've been in danger for 5 years, Thomas. I just didn't know it. At least this way, we're taking control of the situation instead of just waiting for the worst to happen. The next morning brought the first test of their strategy when Sheriff Harrison returned to the saloon with a formal notice of the charges against Sarah. Thomas made sure to be prominently visible during the sheriff's visit, introducing himself as Sarah's fiancé and making it clear that he intended to hire the best legal representation available for her defense. That's your right, of course, Sheriff Harrison said diplomatically. But I hope you understand that I'll have to take her into custody when the marshal arrives. These are serious charges, and she'll need to answer them in Philadelphia. Of course, Thomas replied smoothly. We'll cooperate fully with the legal process. In fact, I'm planning to accompany Miss Carson to Philadelphia to ensure she receives proper representation. I've already telegraphed several law firms they're requesting their services. Sarah watched the sheriff's face carefully as Thomas spoke, looking for any sign that the message was being received as intended. Harrison was an honest lawman, but he was also a practical politician who understood that wealthy men with influential connections could make his job much more difficult if they chose to. "I'll make sure to mention your cooperation in my report to the marshal," Harrison said finally. "Might help with the arrangements for bail and such." After the sheriff left, Thomas immediately headed for the telegraph office to send messages that would give substance to his claims about hiring lawyers. But instead of contacting law firms, he was reaching out to his network of contacts in law enforcement and private investigation, people who could quietly begin looking into Jonathan Whitmore's financial activities. Sarah spent the morning working in the saloon as usual, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy while her world teetered on the edge of complete upheaval. The regular customers had heard about the charges by now, and their reactions ranged from supportive to suspicious. Most seemed willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, but she could see the uncertainty in their eyes. Around noon, Betty approached her with a concerned expression and an envelope that had been delivered by a special courier from the territorial capital. "This came for you," Betty said quietly. The man who brought it said it was urgent. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she opened the envelope and read the brief message inside. It was from Jonathan Whitmore himself, and the words made her blood run cold. "My dear Sarah," the letter began in Jonathan's familiar, careful handwriting. "I was so pleased to learn of your recent engagement. It seems you have found someone willing to overlook your unfortunate circumstances and provide you with the security you have always sought. However, I feel it is my duty to inform your fiancé of certain facts about your character that he may not be aware of. I will be arriving in Copper Creek within the week to speak with him personally about these matters. I trust that once he understands the full scope of your family's criminal activities, he will reconsider his generous offer of marriage. Until then, I remain your devoted friend, Jonathan Whitmore." Sarah read the letter twice before the full implication sank in. Jonathan was coming to Copper Creek personally, abandoning the safety of letting the law handle the situation from a distance. He was so concerned about the threat she represented that he was willing to risk direct confrontation. When Thomas returned from the telegraph office an hour later, Sarah showed him the letter and watched his expression grow grimmer with each line. "He's more desperate than we thought," Thomas said finally. "This isn't the move of a man who's confident in his position. This is panic." "Or arrogance," Sarah replied. "Maybe he thinks he can intimidate both of us into backing down if he confronts us directly." Thomas folded the letter and handed it back to her. "Either way, we'll be ready for him. I've got people looking into his financial records now, and I've contacted a Pinkerton detective who specializes in bank fraud. If Jonathan Whitmore has been stealing money, we'll find proof. And if we can't find proof in time..." Thomas's expression hardened, and Sarah saw a glimpse of the dangerous man he had become during his years on the frontier. "Then we'll make our own proof. One way or another, Jonathan Whitmore is going to pay for what he's done to you." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor when a well-dressed woman in traveling clothes stepped off the afternoon stage and made her way directly to the saloon. She was older than Sarah, perhaps 35, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing as they surveyed the establishment. When she approached the bar and asked to speak with Sarah Carson, Pete's protective instincts immediately activated. "Depends on who's asking," he said cautiously. "We've had enough trouble lately without inviting more." The woman smiled and extended a gloved hand. "Mrs. Helen Cartwright, from the Pinkerton Detective Agency. I believe Mr. Brennan may have mentioned my name in his telegram this morning." Thomas emerged from the back room at the mention of his name, his relief evident when he saw the woman. "Helen, thank God you could come so quickly. This is Sarah, the woman I told you about." Mrs. Cartwright studied Sarah with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. "Miss Carson, I understand you're in quite a predicament. Mr. Brennan has asked me to investigate some potentially fraudulent charges against you, but I should warn you that my services don't come cheap." "Money isn't an object," Thomas said immediately. "Whatever it costs to prove Sarah's innocence, I'll pay." "It's not about money," Sarah interrupted, surprising both Thomas and the detective. "It's about justice. If Jonathan Whitmore has been stealing money and using my family as a scapegoat, then other people have been hurt by his crimes. Other families might have lost their savings or inheritances. This isn't just about clearing my name anymore." Mrs. Cartwright nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of motivation that leads to successful investigations. Personal vendettas can cloud judgment, but A genuine desire for justice tends to uncover the truth. As evening approached, and the saloon filled with its usual crowd, Sarah felt a strange sense of anticipation rather than the dread that had plagued her for the past few days. For the first time since leaving Philadelphia, she was taking an active role in shaping her destiny rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond her control. The pieces were in motion now, and within days she would either be vindicated or destroyed. But regardless of the outcome, she would face it with the man she loved beside her, and that made all the difference in the world. Jonathan Whitmore arrived in Copper Creek on a Tuesday morning, stepping off the westbound stage with the bearing of a man accustomed to having his presence acknowledged and respected. He was impeccably dressed despite the long journey, his dark suit still pressed, and his shoes polished to a mirror shine. At 30 years old, he had grown into the kind of distinguished appearance that suggested both wealth and authority, exactly what one would expect from the son of Philadelphia's most prominent banker. Sarah watched him from her usual position behind the saloon's front window, her stomach clenched with a mixture of fear and anticipation. It had been 5 years since she had seen the man who had once been her fiancé, and she was struck by how little he seemed to have changed. Where both she and Thomas bore the marks of their struggles on the frontier, Jonathan appeared untouched by hardship, as if he had spent the intervening years in comfortable certainty of his place in the world. Mrs. Cartwright had been working around the clock for 3 days, and her preliminary findings had been encouraging. Through her network of contacts in Eastern banks and government offices, she had uncovered several irregularities in the Whitmore Bank's trust account management during the period following Sarah's father's death. Nothing definitive yet, but enough to suggest that a more thorough investigation would bear fruit. "He's here," Sarah announced quietly to Thomas and Mrs. Cartwright, who were reviewing documents at a corner table. "Just got off the stage." Thomas rose and joined her at the window, his hand resting casually on his gun belt as he studied the man who had caused Sarah so much pain. "He looks exactly like what I expected," Thomas said grimly. "Soft and comfortable, like someone who's never had to fight for anything in his life." "Don't underestimate him," Mrs. Cartwright warned from behind them. Comfortable men who suddenly find themselves threatened can be extremely dangerous, precisely because they have so much to lose and so little experience with actual adversity. They watched as Jonathan made his way across the dusty street toward the hotel, pausing briefly to speak with Sheriff Harrison, who had emerged from his office at the sound of the arriving stage. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the animated nature of their conversation, and she suspected that Jonathan was already beginning his campaign to discredit her and Thomas. "He'll probably want to meet with you privately first," Thomas said to Sarah. "Try to intimidate you into leaving town before I can learn too much about his business dealings. Are you ready for that?" Sarah nodded, though her heart was beating rapidly at the prospect of facing Jonathan again. "I'm ready." "Mrs. Cartwright, how much more time do you need to complete your investigation?" "Another day or two at most," the detective replied. "I'm expecting responses to several important telegrams this afternoon, and if they contain the information I suspect they will, we'll have enough evidence to turn this entire situation around." The confrontation came sooner than expected. Within an hour of his arrival, Jonathan had settled into the hotel and sent a message to the saloon requesting a private meeting with Sarah. The note was politely worded, but carried an unmistakable undertone of command, as if he expected his wishes to be immediately accommodated. Sarah showed the message to Thomas and Mrs. Cartwright, both of whom advised against meeting with Jonathan alone. But Sarah had made up her mind to face her accuser directly, confident that she could handle whatever threats or manipulations he might attempt. "I'll meet with him," she decided, "but not alone and not on his terms. Tell him that if he wants to speak with me, he can come to the saloon this afternoon. It's a public place, and I'll have witnesses to whatever he says." Thomas looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Sarah's expression stopped him. He had learned to recognize the steel in her voice that indicated her mind was made up, and he knew better than to try to change it. "Fine," he agreed reluctantly, "but I'll be watching from across the room, and at the first sign of trouble, this conversation ends." Jonathan arrived at the saloon precisely at 3 o'clock, causing a noticeable stir among the afternoon drinkers who recognized quality when they saw it. He was accompanied by a thin, nervous-looking man whom Sarah assumed was either a lawyer or a private secretary. Both men looked distinctly uncomfortable in the rough surroundings of the Dusty Rose, their refined sensibilities clearly offended by the establishment's rustic atmosphere. Sarah had chosen her position carefully, sitting at a table near the center of the room where their conversation would be partially audible to other patrons but still maintain some privacy. She had dressed conservatively in her best day dress, hoping to project respectability despite her circumstances. "Sarah," Jonathan said as he approached, his voice carrying the same patronizing tone she remembered from their youth. "How good to see you again, though I must say these surroundings are quite a change from what we knew in Philadelphia." "Hello, Jonathan," Sarah replied evenly, gesturing for him to take a seat. "You've traveled a long way. I assume this isn't a social call." Jonathan settled himself in the chair across from her, his companion remaining standing in a position that suggested he was there to observe rather than participate. Jonathan's eyes swept the room, taking in the rough clientele and modest furnishings, and Sarah could see the disdain in his expression. "Indeed not," Jonathan replied. "I'm here on a matter of considerable importance, both to you and to the people you've wronged. I understand you've become engaged to a gentleman of means, and I felt it was my duty to ensure he understands exactly what kind of woman he's proposing to marry." "And what kind of woman is that?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building in her chest. "A thief and a fraud, I'm afraid," Jonathan said with false regret. "A woman who helped her father embezzle substantial sums from several prominent Philadelphia families, including my own. A woman who fled west to avoid prosecution for her crimes." Sarah felt the attention of nearby patrons focusing on their conversation, and she could see Thomas tense at his table across the room. This was exactly what they had expected, but hearing the accusations spoken aloud still stung. "Those are serious charges," Sarah said carefully. "I assume you have evidence to support them?" Jonathan smiled, and Sarah was struck by how cold and calculating the expression made him look. This wasn't the earnest young man she had once been engaged to marry. 5 years had revealed aspects of his character that had been hidden during their courtship. "Oh, yes," he said confidently. "Extensive evidence. Financial records, forged documents, testimony from bank employees who witnessed your father's criminal activities. More than enough to ensure your conviction and imprisonment." "Interesting," Sarah replied, "because I have evidence too. Evidence that suggests someone else had access to those trust accounts. Someone who might have used my father's death as cover for his own criminal activities." For just an instant, Jonathan's composed mask slipped, and Sarah saw a flash of genuine fear in his eyes. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by his practiced expression of concerned condescension. But she had seen enough to know that their suspicions were correct. "I have no idea what you're suggesting," Jonathan said, but his voice carried a slight tremor that hadn't been there moments before. "Your father's crimes are well documented. Any attempt to shift blame to innocent parties will only make your situation worse." "Will it?" Sarah asked, leaning forward slightly. "Or will a thorough investigation reveal that the real thief is still walking free, still stealing from the families who trust him with their money?" Jonathan's companion shifted nervously, and Sarah noticed him glance toward the saloon's entrance as if calculating escape routes. The reaction confirmed her growing certainty that they were dealing with guilty men who were beginning to realize their position wasn't as secure as they had believed. "I think this conversation has gone far enough," Jonathan said, starting to rise from his chair. "I came here as a courtesy to give you one final opportunity to confess your crimes and make restitution. Since you're clearly not prepared to be reasonable, I'll have to let the law take its course." "Wait," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet saloon. The words that had been building in her heart for 5 years finally found their voice, and she stood to face the man who had tried to destroy her life. "Name your price." Jonathan paused, confusion flickering across his features. "I beg your pardon?" "Name your price," Sarah repeated, her voice growing stronger. "How much money will it take for you to withdraw these false charges and disappear from my life forever? How much is my silence worth to you?" The saloon had gone completely silent now, every patron straining to hear what would happen next. Thomas had risen from his chair, his hand resting on his gun, ready to intervene if necessary. Mrs. Cartwright was watching from the bar, her detective's instincts fully engaged. Jonathan's face had gone pale, and Sarah could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool afternoon air. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice was barely a whisper. You know exactly what I'm talking about, Sarah continued relentlessly. You know that I have investigators looking into your financial dealings. You know that if this case goes to trial, every aspect of your business practices will be examined under oath. You know that the real embezzler is going to be exposed, and it isn't me. This is preposterous, Jonathan blustered, but he was backing toward the door now, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. You have no proof of anything. Mrs. Cartwright chose that moment to step forward, producing a telegram from her reticule. Actually, Mr. Whitmore, we have quite a bit of proof. This telegram just arrived from the Philadelphia office of the Treasury Department. It seems they've been conducting their own investigation into irregularities at your family's bank. Several trust accounts have been systematically looted over the past 6 years, with the stolen funds transferred to accounts controlled by bank officers. Jonathan's face went from pale to gray, and his companion made a move toward the door that was blocked by two of the saloon's larger patrons who had positioned themselves to prevent any hasty exits. The amounts match almost exactly with what you've accused Miss Carson of stealing, Mrs. Cartwright continued calmly. But the dates of the thefts extend well beyond her father's death, suggesting that whoever was responsible continued their criminal activities after he was no longer available to serve as a scapegoat. Furthermore, she added, producing another document, I have here a sworn statement from a former bank employee who witnessed you forging withdrawal authorizations on several occasions. It seems your dismissal of him last year was motivated by his growing suspicions about your activities. Jonathan seemed to crumple before their eyes, the weight of his exposed crimes finally breaking through his carefully constructed facade. You don't understand, he said desperately. I never meant for anyone to get hurt. The money was just sitting there, earning interest for people who already had more than they needed. I was going to pay it back eventually. What about my father? Sarah demanded, her anger finally breaking free after years of suppression. What about the lies you told, the charges you were prepared to see me prosecuted for? Were you going to pay back his reputation too? Jonathan's response was interrupted by the arrival of Sheriff Harrison, accompanied by two federal marshals who had apparently been waiting for exactly this moment. Mrs. Cartwright's investigation had been more thorough than even Sarah had realized, and the detective had clearly been coordinating with federal authorities to ensure that Jonathan's arrest would be handled properly. Jonathan Whitmore, the senior marshal announced, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit perjury. You have the right to remain silent. As the marshals led Jonathan and his companion away in shackles, the saloon erupted in cheers from patrons who had witnessed the dramatic reversal of fortune. Sarah found herself surrounded by well-wishers and supporters, people who had believed in her innocence, even when she had doubted it herself. Thomas pushed through the crowd to reach her, pulling her into his arms with a fierceness that spoke of relief and overwhelming emotion. It's over, he whispered against her hair. It's finally over. But even as Sarah relaxed into his embrace, she knew that the end of Jonathan's threats was really just the beginning. The charges against her would be dropped, her name would be cleared, and the stolen money would be recovered for its rightful owners. But more importantly, she and Thomas could finally build the future they had dreamed of as young people, tempered now by the wisdom that came from surviving hardship and learning what truly mattered in life. Later that evening, after the excitement had died down and the saloon had returned to its normal rhythm, Sarah and Thomas sat together on the front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. Mrs. Cartwright had departed on the evening stage, her work completed with characteristic efficiency. The federal marshals had taken statements from everyone involved and assured Sarah that the charges against her would be formally dismissed within days. What happens now? Sarah asked, leaning against Thomas's shoulder as they shared the peaceful moment. Now we decide what we want our life to look like, Thomas replied, his arm tightening around her. I have that ranch in California, but if you'd rather stay here in Copper Creek, we can build something together in this town. Sarah considered the possibilities, thinking about the people who